Hey guys, just had an amazing conversation with Steve Chalke. A mutual friend made the connection for us, and he's an incredible guy. Um, has a lot on his plate. His schedule's pretty full, so incredibly honored to have had the time to talk with him. He oversees a nonprofit, Oasis Trust. It works in housing and healthcare and educational projects, and we eventually get to some of what he's doing. He tells his story, and he's a great storyteller, about how he first became a Christian, and from the very beginning had a heart to see lives changed, transformed, especially youth. And that's where his focus is. He's a pastor as well, a Baptist pastor that has done a whole lot of rethinking because he's a practical theologian in every sense of the word. I love talking with people who are willing to rethink their understanding of who God is in order to meet the needs and to see actual transformation taking place in the lives, especially of those most oppressed. And Steve has done that in spades. He's a writer as well, and so we talk about his book, many of his books, but we talk about, I think, a significant book for him maybe 10, 12 years ago, The Lost Message of Jesus, where he was processing a God that was better than we had been taught. One that actually would get into our lives and bring a restorative reality, a God in Christ reconciling the world. We talk about what took place at the cross. Steve is giving us insight through the lens of a God who is good, looks like Jesus. He also wrote The Lost Message of Paul. He dives into that at the end. You're going to stick around for this, but he's a theologian who does the heavy lift of let's go really understand Paul. A feminist friend of his was the one who was a catalyst for him diving into this book, and so he really goes into who Paul is, and is Paul presenting the same message of Jesus, the message of Jesus. And we talk about penal substitutionary atonement. We talk about the difference between retributive or restorative justice. And he really spends time on what he's doing right now as a particular project that he's working on, where it's taking a restorative lens on what justice looks like in the lives of those who have been most abused, those who have experienced trauma. Profoundly insightful, beautiful conversation. I think it's going to bless and encourage, and I think a whole lot of folks are going to want to know more about who he is and what he is doing. Guys, love this conversation. These types of conversation, I say it, they're life-giving for me. The one I just had me right on the edge of tears as I was reminded again and again of how loved we are and how good this gospel message is. Just powerful conversation. Anyway, it's going to bless. I'm honored to have these conversations, and I'm thankful that I get to do it with you guys. And if you're looking for ways to connect with the podcast or with myself, you can go to afamilystory.org. A Family Story is our nonprofit. It's where you can sign up for the mailing list, kind of keep up with all things tacos related. It's also where you can give, and we are listener supported and grateful when you partner with us that way. Our Facebook group, community growing over there. It's a Rethinking God with Tacos. We also have Instagram under the same name. All of these places are where you can connect, interact. There's some great conversations taking place and connections happening there. Otherwise, I think I'm in Australia right now with Dub Alexander, and so I'll let you know how that goes. But in the meantime, this is my conversation with Steve Chalke. We've got it. We did it. We made it happen, man. This is wonderful.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to be talking to you because I'm in London and it's a very grey, gloomy day. So It's wonderful to be talking to anyone who's not going through this at the moment.
We were just there. We were talking about it beforehand. It was gray. It was gray while we were there too. But I'm in Charlotte, of course, North Carolina. We get a lot of sun here, man. Have you been? I'm sure you've been to Charlotte.
I've not been to Charlotte at all. No, never.
It's a good spot. The Queen City.
Yeah, I should. It should be on my bucket list. Definitely.
Man, we've been trying to make this happen and connect for a while. I know you have lots going on, but we have a mutual friend in Martine we were talking about beforehand, who made this connect. And as I was getting to know you, the more I was reading about you, and I mean, you can go to Wikipedia and spend about 30 minutes.
I've looked at that stuff occasionally, because people say there's a lot about you, and look at it. The thing about Wikipedia is it may be true, but it may not be true. Who knows? All sorts of stuff that people write on there, isn't it?
Yeah, well, born in 1955 in London. I believe, yeah, that's true. Uh, you grew up in the. Sounds like you grew up in the church. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know that you pastor, but you've got a nonprofit, and you've written, as we were talking beforehand, I think 80 books. So there's a few that are on my list I'd like to get to. I don't think we'll get to all of them, but share a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Anglo-Indian. My dad was Indian, my mum English. They both died now, and I grew up in London. Yeah, I was born in London, in the suburbs of South London. South London is poorer than North London. I don't know if that's generally known, but North London's, the streets are wider, the buildings are taller and shinier, and that's where the rich have lived since Roman times. Actually, it's to do with the Romans. They lived on that side of the Thames, and their servants lived on the south side of the Thames because it was low-lying marshland. So I grew up in South London, and in relative poverty, particularly because my father had come from India after the end of the Second World War to help rebuild the empire, as they used to say. But of course, like those that came from the Caribbean, when he arrived, he found the welcome wasn't quite as warm as he was expecting. And so I'm the first of four kids, and born into that poverty of a family that my father found it hard to get work, hard to get meaningful work. And so that's how I grew up in South London. But my story isn't really, well, it is about that. So I suppose as a kid, I knew what racism was. And as a kid, I knew what poverty was like. And then I went to a school that was terrible. I mean, we were just being prepared to work on a factory line, but yeah, unskilled labor. They told us that we were the kind of kids who wouldn't work with our heads, we work with our hands. I always find that daft because the surgeon works with their head and their hands. It's kind of, you'll work with your hands meant you won't work with your brain. And that was my destiny until I fell in love with a girl. Very briefly, I fell in love with a girl when I was 14, infatuated by her. And I started going to a church youth group because that's where she went on every Friday night. And every Friday night for months and months, I just went and I gazed across the little room. There was table tennis and, some records on. And I just looked on her beauty in the far corner until, it must have frightened her, I think, because one night she sent one of her best friends across to tell my best friend that she thought I was ugly and she would never, ever be seen dead with me. And I don't blame her really, because I'd spent months staring at her. And that's the night that changed my life, because I wandered home, and I wandered home from this little youth club in the church, and crestfallen because this girl, Mary Hooper was her name. I still know her, by the way. And, and I thank her very often for what she said now. And because I wandered home and I thought, Mary Hooper doesn't love me. My life's purposeless. There is no point in me being here at all. At my school are right. My life doesn't add up to anything. And then I got this thought that what the message they give me in the church youth group, they used to do little epilogues and things, and they were nice guys. It's a different message. They tell me my life matters and it's got meaning and purpose. Whereas, as my school tell me, fodder for the factory production line, and that's it. And I decided there and then, I can remember it like yesterday, I'm going to believe the church's story, not the youth club story, the church's story, not the school story. And I'm going to go back next week, Friday, even if Mary Hooper doesn't fancy me, and I'm going to tell them I'm going to be a Christian. And then I had this strange thought. I thought, well, if I'm going to be a Christian, I better become a church leader, a Christian leader. And I am going to, when I grow up, set up a school that's worth going to and a house for children to live in who no one's loved and cared for. My mum and dad were great, but I had friends who weren't cared for. And I'm going to set up a hospital. I don't know where that thought came from, but honestly, that ran through my head. I got in. My dad was out because he was doing shift work. He worked on the railroads and he was working night shift that week. My mum said, have you have a nice evening? I didn't tell her that Mary Hooper didn't fancy me. I just said, yep, I'm going to be a Christian. I'm going to become a church leader. And when I grow up, I'm going to start a school and a house and a hospital. And my mum left education very early. So she just looked at me and she said, very nice. And that was it. That was it, Jason. And so everything I've been able to be involved in since then, I owe it to God and Mary Hooper.
God and Mary Hooper.
Working together in partnership.
Is that the title? That's going to be the title of your memoir, God and Mary Hooper.
God who loves me and Mary Hooper who definitely didn't.
So you go back. I love this story, man. That's amazing. And I guess you end up back at that little youth group or church somewhere along the way. Actually, let me rephrase that because I find this fascinating in how God presents himself as real. Because I think the way that God presented himself there was even through the church. Because my question is, well, maybe when's that time that you realized beyond the church seeing who you were and defining you that God actually loved you, like a personal. Was that the moment you said, "All right, Jesus," or was it a growing relationship?
No, I just went back the next Friday and I told all these old men that were the youth workers there, they were really old, but they were kind. They were so kind that I decided that I wanted to follow Jesus. I knew that, we were supposed to change the world. That was the basic deal, as I understood it. And they said, "Oh, yeah, that's good." And I said, "And when I grow up, I want to set up a school, hospital, and that." And so one of them looked at me, these really old guys, and I thought they were very wise. He said, "Well, if you want to do those things, when you leave school, you better study theology." And now I'd never heard of theology, I'd hardly heard of biology, to tell you the truth. But theology was beyond me. But here's this very old, wise guy saying, theology is the answer. If you want to start a school and a house, you better do theology. And you want to be a church leader, it's all the same. Do theology. And what I didn't realize at the time, of course, because I was only 14, that these guys, though they looked old to me, they were only 21 and 22, and they were all theology students. And they were theology students at the theology college up the road. There was and they were running the youth club in their spare time. But they were fantastic. They took me under my wing. They taught me to play the guitar. I joined a band they set up. We went and played in other youth clubs. We told people about our faith and our, et cetera, et cetera. They gave me my first chances of public speaking, and they guided me through. It was amazing.
Let's just talk about it. You do have a school. You did become a leader in the church.
What happened was this. Firstly, I kept going to the youth club. And secondly, I discovered that even if there's one girl that doesn't fancy you in the Christian church youth group, there's always another one. And in actual fact, my wife, her name's Cornelia, and she was in that same youth club. There you go. So we got married when we were 24, I went to theological college when I was 21. We got married in my last year of theological college, and I said, Cornelia, if you marry me, we're going to go and live on a housing estate, and we're going to set up a school and a house and a hospital. I'd not thought it through really how all this would happen, why every housing estate needed its own hospital, for instance. Uh, and she was as naive as I. Well, not quite as naive as me, but we set off as 24-year-olds to do this. In actual fact, what happened was I worked for a church as a youth worker for 4 years, which was fantastic fun. And then I said to the leaders of this church, look, I got to leave because I got to start a school and a hospital, etc. And they very kindly allowed us to keep living in the house that came with the job of being a youth minister for 12 months. They said, we can't pay you. You're on your own, but we will give you free accommodation for 12 months. Then we got to get some other guy to do your job. So you got to leave them. We wouldn't do this if we were you, because how are you going to live? But off I sat, and we worked out. Cornelia, my wife, said to me, she said, we should start a house first, and for kids who've got nowhere to go, supported housing. And I remember saying to her when she said that, well, why a house and not a school or a hospital? And she said, well, it's simple. She said, we don't know anything, do we? Like,
Right,
if you had a
right,
school,
right,
what would we
right.
do? Which is a very good point. And, although by then I knew a little church history and a bit of systematic theology and all that kind of stuff, but not a lot good for starting a house.
That's the practical side of theology, right?
Yeah, which I didn't learn at theological college. It was more what Calvin thought, than what the house developer thought. And so, to cut a long story short, because it gets boring, I left the job. We worked like so hard at this. No one would trust us. I was 29 by then. No one would trust us. No one would return our calls. No one would give us any money. No, we had no contacts, no salary, no nothing. But by a series of what were actually miracles, we ended up being given a house in the town we want in inner London, in a place called Peckham. The house, I should say, had 16 bedrooms, but no roof. And no stairs from the first floor to that. It was all wrecked. But that got us going, and we slowly rebuilt it and then opened it. And my wife said, Cornelia said, this house with these 16 bedrooms, we're going to create shelter for these young people who've been on the streets or been abused or had violence done to them, etc., neglect. And she said, this house is going to be like as though we were giving them Oasis. This is creating Oasis for them. So let's call this Oasis. And long story short, we set up a charity, what you'd call a 501c3, a not-for-profit, and called it Oasis. And that was the first house. And then everything's happened from there. And now we run more houses, sheltered houses, supported houses than I can even tell you. And because I don't know a lot. And schools, we develop schools. We run in England 53 schools. We've got 35,000 children in our schools. We run health centres. We run all sorts of things. The latest thing we just begun here. We work in other countries because I'm half Indian, so we began working in India and some African countries and a couple of Asian countries, and do the same kind of thing there, but not to the scale here. We employ around 6,000 people now in England, and so all those things have come to be, and lots of others. The latest thing we've set up is an alternative to a jail for young people who've committed violent crime that's therapeutic and caring for them.
I'm going to talk about the latest thing, but this is what fascinates me, and I'd be curious. I went to Bible college, met my wife there, and I too learned about Calvin, and a whole lot of wonderful theology and some things that I've left. But what fascinates me in this journey is you take a house, and where the theological becomes practical, where it becomes relational, where the things you learned, because this is my experience, and I'd be curious. I'm sure, because I've done enough reading and I've heard you talk, that this is somewhat yours as well. But some of the things I might have thought about God here, when I begin to apply what it looks like to establish his kingdom or love people practically from this place, it gets messy, it gets real, and suddenly you have a conflict between some of the things that you were raised in about what God was like, as opposed to what actually transforms and changes people. And I'd be curious. I mean, you're in a house, you say it and it's beautiful, but I mean, let's go on the ground for a moment. That first house, I imagine you have story after story where theology had to become practical hands and feet, and where you had to be continually stretched as you rediscover who God really is in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that happened uh, is so we set up this house. It was a painful experience. Um, it's such a painful experience. God, I feel that this is what we should be doing, housing those who are the homeless. This is the gospel lived out. This is what you told us to do. Again, this is what Jesus' story is about, and here we're trying to do it, and nothing works for us. It was so frustrating, so incredibly frustrating. In fact, I once spoke at a big conference, and and there was a worship leader, a song leader, who there was a crowd of several thousand people, and he led some songs, and then he wanders off. Oh no, he didn't wander off stage. He says at the end of this, and now Steve Chalke will come and talk to us, and I had to talk about justice. But the last song and a video that went with it were about social justice, and they were about poverty. And I was so overwhelmed by this video and the words of this song, this lyric, and so frustrated that I've been working on getting this house for these kids set up, and we could get nowhere with it. And kids were living off the streets, and they were being groomed into violence, and they were becoming addicted, and they were being raped, etc., etc. I knew about all this stuff, and here we were singing this worship song to this God of justice, kind of, etc., etc. And I was boiling inside. I was so angry inside, like God, like, I'm supposed to be singing this worship song to you because you're the God of justice and love and mercy and all that kind of stuff, and yet I cannot get this thing going, and we've been living on next to nothing for the last 3 years just to get this going, and it's not happening. Anyway, they'd announced me to speak, and I walked to the center of the stage, and I walked to this podium, and I stood, with these microphones looking at me out of this giant crowd, huge crowd, looked there, and I was so angry with God and life and frustrated, I couldn't actually say anything. Yeah, I literally couldn't say anything. I couldn't make a word come out of my mouth. And then the guy who'd been leading the songs, I knew him, and he obviously read this somehow, and he wandered back out onto the stage, and he held me, and he led me off the stage. And it's the shortest talk I've ever given in my life, because it consisted of absolutely no words. I could not recover through the frustration, and so this thing that the kind of, if you pray about it hard enough it will happen, and all that kind of stuff I used to believe, all this begins falling away through all of that. And then of course what happened is we had finally got this place open, and we'd worked on it so hard, and my wife's a bit of an artist, and we decorated the walls, got art, we'd done up their bedrooms, it was beautiful. And these kids start arriving, and as they come in, they don't smile at you. They won't shake your hand. They won't greet you. They won't look at you. Not one of them would look you in the eyes. No, please. No, thank you. No, I'm grateful. And then over the next few weeks, they stole all the stuff out of the rooms. and sold it to people. It was their own gear, and they sold it and then complained that they didn't have it. And so a second thing had to happen to me. I mean, there were so many lessons I learned because I'd learned that this was all about sin. This was lack of gratitude, that these people were wrong. And here was I, this generous, kind Christian helping. And I slowly worked out, and it's a terrible thing. It took me so long. But if these children had broken arms or legs, these young people, they're all teenagers, then I would have compensated for their inability to make their way through a door or climb stairs. I would have opened doors for them. I would have compensated. But I slowly worked out, this was in the 1980s, you see, end of the 1980s, that their wounds must be in their heads somehow. And I couldn't see these wounds, and so I was judging them, but the problem was mine, not theirs. And so that starts changing your whole concept of sin and not sin, and who's sinner and who's not a sinner. And I learned that what middle classness isn't sainthood, but often from the middle classes, you look at someone who, isn't quite there. And so that all went out the window. And so on and on and on. Your experience changes your theology, doesn't it? And you see it more clearly. You read the Gospels with a clarity that you didn't have before.
There's so much there, man. There's so much there. Hey, guys, I hope the podcast is blessing. Family Stories are a nonprofit. Started 10 years ago. The goal was to make media content catalytic for an encounter with the love of God, and I think we're doing it. Had no idea what that would all entail, and in the last year has been blown away by what's happened around this podcast. Rethinking God with Tacos. The community that's gathered, the relationships and friendships that have been made, the conversations that have been had, the impact has been actually quite profound in our lives. And I'm daily hearing from folks who have been encouraged because of the conversations being had. Catalytic for an encounter with the love of God. Listen, we're listener supported. And as this thing has grown, it's taken a little bit more of my time I love to give. And we've also had folks come along to help, and I'm so grateful for that. But it all works because you guys partnering with us and giving. And so I'm grateful for those who have partnered in that way. Incredibly grateful. And in inviting you who are watching this now, if you've been impacted, if this has blessed you, and you'd like to see it continue to improve and expand, I'd invite you to give. You can go to afamilystory.org, afamilystory.org. We're a nonprofit, and so you can give there. You can also sign up for our mailing list, keep up with us, all things tacos, all things A Family Story, conferences, new books, Zoom calls, all of the amazing ways by which we're connecting the Facebook community. So thankful for you guys. Familystory.org. Sign up for our mailing list. Partner with us by giving, and we'll continue to have those conversations that are hopefully like the one you're listening to now, catalytic for an encounter with our Father's affection. All right, guys, back to the podcast. Love you. See you soon. This is the journey that led you to the lost message of Jesus, which is came, I'm sure, many, many years later. As I imagine you began to put, it takes a minute to put language around, especially when you're challenging the systems and the ideas that have been institutionalized.
Well, I'll tell you the story that led me to writing The Lost Message of Jesus. I later wrote a book called The Lost Message of Paul. So Oasis was developing, and as well as developing in this country, we developed in India, because my father was Indian, and we work a lot in India. And there are several stories I could tell you at this point, because they all came together in different ways. But I was in India in the city of Bombay, Mumbai, its new name. Both names are used. In a slum where we work, we set up a school in a shack, and we were uh, doing all sorts of pastoral work in the community. In the biggest slum in Mumbai, it's called Dharavi. It's where Slumdog Millionaire, that film, was made. And the poverty there is huge, obviously, and the life is cheap. And I remember standing in a shack with a mother with a baby in her arms, 2 weeks old, a week old, I'm not sure. And I watched her cry as she held her baby as her baby died in her arms. And her baby was dying of dehydration because there was no clean water. And all that child needed was a little sachet of salts that cost a few cents. And that would have been enough to rehydrate this child. But the child was dying of dysentery for lack of that dehydration. And the mum was weeping as she watched her child pass. And as I looked down on that scene, there was nothing that I could do to help in those minutes. It was the last moments of this child's life. And I was praying for that child's survival. And I walked out of that shack changed because I realized this, that if God was all powerful and in control of everything and hadn't intervened in that moment, he wasn't the kind of God that I wanted to worship, because I would have done better than that. If I could have changed that child's destiny, I would have done it in that instant. And why God didn't intervene, it threw in the bucket most of what I'd learned at theological college. I realized that it's different to that. And then over that year, because Oasis was expanding, I remember being in Thailand and I watched children who'd been dumped, abandoned in Bangkok, actually. And we'd set up a way of supporting a hostel that worked with these kids. But there were hundreds of them. And they were so dysregulated. Have you ever seen it? I'm sure you have. A child that rocks backwards and forwards with no speech. You know, they rock incessantly because they're so disturbed. I don't know if you know why people rock like that. It's because they're imitating the heartbeat of their mother. The womb is a place of safety, and the rhythm brought them safety, but they can't deal with this alien world. So I sat with a kid like that on one occasion, and I couldn't speak to him. He had no language anyway. He was about 9 years old, and I sat with him on the edge of the bed and I stroked him. And as I was stroking him, slowly he stopped rocking, as I now know, because of the psychology I understand and the neuroscience I understand now. I didn't understand it then. That was a natural thing to happen. But then I had to go. And as I left the room where he was, in this old abandoned hospital where he had nothing, I just watched him begin to rock again. And it was through those experiences, Jason, that I realized if God could do something and God didn't do something, I wanted to take him on. He wasn't going to judge me. I was going to judge him. As you know, and he could do what he liked with me as a result, but that was okay. At least I needed to get the moment to speak up for these people who nobody would speak up for. I decided that. So that left me in a really tricky point, because do I just abandon Christianity and church and faith and the Bible and all of that because it doesn't make any sense to me? Or do I rethink it? So I've either got to, you've got to have integrity. You've got to be honest with yourself. Can I read this text with integrity have I misunderstood it? Is it saying something else? Because if it's not saying something else, I've got to abandon it, throw it in the bin and walk away from this and give my life to something more meaningful. So the theological change is always driven by your experience of the real world, isn't it?
Wow, it
Anyway,
100%.
I'm still here, so I rethought it. That's why I wrote The Lost Message of Jesus.
It's what burns in me hearing you talk about it, because and the experience that you're talking about is that's my journey as well, and that you can almost call it a violent inner thing that takes place in you, where you're like, I'm either better than God, or I've got to rethink some things. This math doesn't compute. This God that I've been taught about. I mean, I've had those moments, like the moment on a stage where you're like the hypocrisy of what I'm participating in, with the lack of impact, and the fact that this doesn't, even in your own life. I mean, like you said, I've actually got a book titled "God Is Not in Control. The Whole Story's Better Than You Think." I tend to wrestle as I write, and that took 5 years to write, but it was, in the same context of a person losing a child and being told that God just needed another angel in heaven, and having to come to the same conclusion of, what kind of mental gymnastics do I have to do around his goodness to still participate in this institutional understanding of who he. A whole lot of the folks that are listening, what you're speaking resonates. Because that's what we do. How can we rediscover who he is as Jesus revealed? So that's profoundly powerful. I know you experienced pushback.
Yeah, when I wrote The Lost Message of Jesus here in the UK, I was put on trial by the Evangelical Alliance, the evangelicals, because what I said, and then what really upset them, because I wanted to say, what's lost about the message of Jesus? Who was Jesus? And I slowly discovered, I obviously read a lot in order to write this, but I slowly realized I was a Baptist minister, you see. I am a Baptist minister. So I thought, well, Jesus was a preacher, except instead of preaching in the local church, he preached in the local synagogue. And he had this weird thing of preaching out on the streets, and, which is a bit embarrassing. We don't do that anymore because we've seen people do it, and it is embarrassing.
Well, it is, but we also don't know how to do it without penal substitutionary atonement. But we'll get there.
Yeah. So I kind of worked out, first of all, hang on a minute. Jesus wasn't a preacher. He was a social activist. He mixed with all the wrong people. He was friends with everybody who wasn't supposed to be friends with. And the only people he was frustrated and angry with were the religious leaders who kept telling everybody who was in and who was out. In fact, he called them whitewashed tombs. That's like some pretty strong language. So I realized that Jesus was a person who came and did surprising things, extraordinary things. It was what he did that made you think. And then sometimes he told a story and left a question, so I realized we got Jesus all wrong. And I realized that Jesus' message was that those who believe they're out are in. Blessed are you who are spiritually poor, who are poor. Blessed are you who mourn. Blessed you who are put down by the Romans and written off. Blessed is everybody who's ruled out by the religious snobs. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. And where is the kingdom of heaven? It's here. It's not pie in the sky when you die. The kingdom of heaven is God's dimension in this life. The kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven is all around you. So then I've grown up with this, what you call penal substitution, this view, which, I was taught, God doesn't like most people. In fact, God doesn't like almost everyone. In fact, there is nothing, Calvinism, there is nothing good with any human. There's no leftover, there's no trace, a remnant of good in our lives, because we're all original sinners and we're under God's wrath and we're under God's judgment. But God's, because he's love, he sends his son to die on the cross, and God beats Jesus up. God takes out the punishment for my sin on his son. God's wrath is on Jesus, and Jesus has to cry, where are you? Where are you, God? Because God has abandoned his son, because Jesus has become the arch criminal, and God might be love, but he's justice. And he demands blood, so that if I pray a prayer and I say, I'm a miserable sinner, a worm, and there's nothing good in me, but because the blood of Jesus was shed, then God can look at Jesus instead of me and I can be forgiven. And I thought, what a crock. Like, what a crock this whole thing is, so Jesus is hanging on the cross where Jesus died. The wrath of God was satisfied, and I realized this just doesn't make sense. God is love, and the Bible talks about God's irrepressible love for every human being that's made in His image. The Bible talks about our original goodness. And God made them male and female. He created them. And He said, it's very good. Original goodness. And the verses we use for original sin, the story of Adam and Eve and the talking snake and all the rest of it, no Jewish scholar before Jesus or since Jesus has ever said it's got anything to do with original sin. And we know that because of the Mishnah. So we know that the written sayings of the scribes, etc. We know, and Jesus knew, no Jewish scholar had ever said the book of that creation story, the Adam and Eve creation story, was to do with original sin. It doesn't contain the word sin. It doesn't talk about a devil, and so we've written this thing in. In fact, one of my very good friends who died at the beginning of the pandemic was the chief rabbi of Great Britain, called Dr. Jonathan Sacks, who was a national figure. And one day I was speaking at an event with him, and I said, because I was searching this a long time ago, I said, what do you make of that original thing and the story of Adam and Eve? And he said, he's so witty, Jonathan Sacks. He said, he said, a Christian asking a Jew what the book of Genesis means. And then he said, that's bright. He said, that's bright. He said, because the thing is, he said, mostly you Christians, you stole our Hebrew Bible, you renamed it the Old Testament. You don't speak Hebrew. You don't dream in Hebrew. You don't understand our concepts and our stories. You understand nothing about this. And then you come along and tell us what it means. He said this is what it's about. He said, in front of you is always the tree with the low-hanging fruit of instant gratification. And God calls us to a longer route, a different way. Don't take the low-hanging fruit. It deceives you. And you'll end up living east of Eden, because that's what happens. They live in the Garden of Eden, in paradise. And Adam and Eve choose the easy route, the low-hanging fruit. And they end up still made in God's image, but living east of where they would, not quite where they would be. And Jonathan said to me, and that is a decision each one of us has to make on a daily basis. It comes at us all the time. Do we walk the way of love and the way of God, or do we choose a different way? And every time we choose a different way, we end up east of where we should be.
Wow. My goodness, brother. Hey, guys. I want to tell you about my friend JD Cobb. jdcobbproductions.com. If you've seen an uptick on the quality, and I think you're going to see more in the coming days, that's because of JD and his amazing staff and crew and all the folks that he works with. jdproductions.com. Look at, he's focused not just on podcasts and television shows. He also helps us with our GAN show, along with the show I do with Baxter Kruger. He stepped in halfway through, and you'll see the quality immensely increase. He knows what he's doing. Whether you're looking to inform, entertain, or inspire, JD Cobb Productions customizes a plan to speak to your audience. I'd encourage you to let them bring your podcast vision to life with expert storytelling and production skills. Look, I love JD, thankful for the impact he's made in my life as a friend, and I'm grateful for what he's done for our podcast, and I couldn't recommend him enough. If you're a podcaster or have something else you're producing, want to put together commercials, there's all kinds of other work that they do. So jdcobbproductions.com. Check them out. It all comes down to this what you just said, love. And on my own journey, we call it, I love what you just said, we say we're in the long game of love. We're not in this low hang, we're actually in the long game of love, and you can apply that in so many different ways. But
So what Jesus does on the cross, just in my view, my understanding, I should say that, is exactly that. Jesus, all his life teaches, love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy, go the extra mile, lay down your life, turn the other cheek. As a metaphor, for give your best, go to the person, greet the person, go first. And he does that. He shows that he's not going to return the blow for another blow. He is going to go the extra mile. And he hangs on the cross, not because of the wrath of God, but because of the weakness of Pilate to make a good choice, because of the power of the Roman Empire. He hangs on the cross not because of my sins or your sins. He hangs on the cross because of the sins and the failures and the cowardice of the people around him, because the weakness of his followers. He hangs on the cross and he dies there. And his message is, as he rises from the dead, you can afford to walk my way too, the way of love. You don't have to fight back. You don't have to get the last word. You don't have to put the extra punch in. You can afford to walk the route of reconciliation. And even if they crucify you, there is life beyond that. And for me, that's a message that makes sense for me every day of my life.
you used the word justice. You couldn't. In my own journey, I've shared the story here enough, and just to open up the conversation, the rediscovering of what his justice is in the context of love, in the context of others and self-giving, this love, that there's no greater love that one would lay his life down for a friend. And as you reframe and realize, I'm not a punishment has never changed anyone. It's never transformed anyone. It is the antithesis of what actually transforms us. It's the kindness of God. It's the goodness of God that leads us to change the way we think, and we're transformed by that encounter. And so you use that word justice. Practically, you are now, this new thing you're doing, I know, is a restorative perspective on justice that I would love you to speak to a little bit, because I think this is where there's true transformation actually happens.
What you do is an outcome of what you believe, isn't it? Always. What we believe affects who we we become what we believe. So it's taken 14 years to set this up. But in a conversation that began with government in 2010, I said to a government minister I was privileged to be able to speak to, there is no justice for young people in our country. If you're born poor, if you're black, not white, if you're neurodivergent, if you're on the autistic spectrum, for instance, if you're what we call here looked after, fostered, you're shoved from pillar to post, from home to home with no love, no care. If you're in that situation, if you've been traumatized because your dad beat you, you watched your father beating your mum black and blue, your father's gone, your mum was never available to love you, if you've had no secure attachments in your life, if you've never felt seen or heard or safe or secure or soothed, well, the reality is that all behavior is communication of what we believe. Yes, as we just said. And so what we see as antisocial behavior, aggressive behavior, is born of anger, it's born of fear, but it's coming out from the inside. And to your point, Jason, punishing people achieves nothing. I mean, your country, just like our country, we got prisons full all over the place, and I know you have, because you can't punish people into health. You can't you can't hurt someone to help them. You can't wound someone and hope they're going to emerge wonderful middle class people who can't wait to go and work for a charity and give their lives to others. They emerge angrier than they were and more troubled than they were. So the question is always this: if you attempt to tackle the behavior without the drivers of that behavior, you get nowhere. So the question is always, why does this kid kick off? Why do they lose it? Why won't they look you in the eyes? I learned that when we first set up that hostel. Why won't they? Because it's what's in them. Let's deal with the drivers. They've not been loved. They've not been cared. And the only way through that is to build relationship, to be there with them, which is what Jesus did, of course, with the tax collectors and the sinners, and as they were called, and the people no one else. He was with them. He parted with them. He had meals with them. He sat round tables with them. He loved them. And that's the transformational thing. So using neuroscience, because now this isn't just a theory, of course, this is now the science. We know this, because of MRI scanners. We know that if you're not loved, your brain grows in one way and is dysfunctional in some ways. We know that if you're loved and soothed, your brain will develop differently. I often say to people about me, I say it about anybody, right? But I say it about me. When I'm stressed, I do stupid things. When I'm stressed, I say things I wish I hadn't said. The more stressed I am, the more stupid I get, and the more apologizing I have to do when I calm down. What if you're a child or an adult who's always stressed, who lives with toxic, traumatic stress the whole time? What if you're a child who's what we call hypervigilant because they're always aware of the danger? They never feel safe anywhere. Their behaviors will reflect their inner condition. And what we do is we punish them for the lack of love, the lack of care, the lack of safety, the lack of soothing, the lack of being seen that's been their lot in life. And so Oasis Restore, we've called it, it's the first thing like it in British history. We're the first not-for-profit, we're the first charity to be able to, we had to have a law of parliament passed, a new law passed to allow us to do it. But we start with children who are the most high risk. These kids have murdered people, attempted to murder people, attempted to rape people. They've been violent, all violent crime. Some of them only just teenagers, up to the age of 18. But we work with them. We work with them. You know what it's like when you've got a toddler, and the toddler can be smiling, a 3-year-old can smile at you 1 minute, and the next minute they throw themselves on the floor and the world's coming into an end and they're in a tantrum and they're screaming. And then what you do is you distract them and you soothe them, and 2 minutes later they're laughing and happy again. You know that. What if you've never been soothed? What if you've never, in actual fact, we now know that a 3-year-old can't self-regulate, so they have to be externally regulated by their parental figure. What if you've never been externally regulated till you can self-regulate? Well, what we do in the Western world is we lock you up and punish you for it. So we're doing something different. And it's an outworking of theology, the theology of Jesus. Hey, Karl Barth, I should say this and that, throw in a New Testament scholar. Karl Barth may be the greatest New Testament scholar of the 20th century. The great Karl Barth said this. Lots of people think he's complicated. He's not complicated. He just wrote about 6 million words, but it's simple if you really read it. One of the things he says is this: God is love. Any expression of God's wrath, God's anger, etc., that is just a it that doesn't rhyme with love. Any way of interpreting these things isn't love. And I say, extending this, any church policy, any church doctrine, any church practice, any Christian attitude, any Christian teaching, any Christian song that doesn't rhyme with God is love has to be wrong.
All of these things that they actually discovered then in a love, and a love that Jesus revealed that lays its life down. This is the love that you can trust. This is the restorative lens on. I'm curious. I know you could probably get into the nitty gritty, but this restorative lens that is connected to neuroscience. I heard you say secure attachment at one point. All of these ways in which we're discovering how we live, move, and have our being. I'm pretty blown away by what you're doing and what you're talking about here, man. It's pretty amazing stuff. I've often said I love talking with counselors or those that are working with folks in the actual nitty-gritty aspects of their life, who because they're practical theologians in that they might have some construct that was given to them, but they're more interested in transformation. And so they're going to actually interact with the person through the lens of love. They'll rethink their theology later, but they're really interested in transformation.
Well, another gem actually from Jonathan Sacks again. I've written extensively about this in The Lost Message of Paul, but I asked Jonathan Sacks one day about the phrase God's wrath in the Old Testament, or sometimes wrath is translated as anger. It depends on the translation. Meaning God's wrath, God's anger. And Jonathan smiled at me and he said, he's much older than me, so he treated me as a bit of a son. And he said, I think you'll find, Stephen, he called me, I think you'll find, Stephen, if you study the Hebrew words for God's anger, they're far better translated as God's anguish. And that's the point. If you do study the words, they all talk, they're about emotion. God's emotion, because God is love. God's anguish. God looks at our brokenness. He looks at our mistakes. He looks at our hatred for one another, our warring with one another, our abuse of one another. God's anguish. Because God's way, the dimension of heaven, is love.
When I was 21 or 22, I had a profound experience where I felt like I had a conversation with my Heavenly Father. But I'd begged him to come because I was going to change the world. And I stayed up all night and I prayed the prayer, I won't let you go unless you bless me. This was my wrestling. I'm going to wrestle Jacob wrestled with the angel. I'm going to do the same thing. And in the early hours of the morning, I felt my Heavenly Father speaking to me. And I heard him say, he said to me, he said, Jason, I told him, I just want what's on your heart. And he said, Jason, I don't think you know what you're asking for. And but if you want to know what's on my heart, he said, I'll show you. But it was a very serious interaction. And I said, yes, I do. And I was very serious about it. I was thinking, because I was 21 and I wanted to change the world, and it was a sincere desire, I was thinking he was about to tell me about the kind of man of God I'd become and the great call of my life. But instead, for probably what was only a minute but felt like an eternity, I felt the pain of my father for the brokenness of this world. And I began to wail. I just wept and overwhelmed by and I knew I was just perceiving just the smallest drop of what he felt. And when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, I was suddenly in his arms, and I was in my father's arms. And that marked me, because I've like you, I've been some places in the world and I've walked into rooms, but whenever I walk into the room, I'm reminded of that at 21. He said, hey, because he really said, if you want to know my heart, I'll hold you to it. Like I'll let you in, but I'll hold you to it. And I was reminded of that again as you were talking, of that moment in my life. And and the journey, the pursuit that has been my pursuit of what does justice look like? What does Jesus? Who is Jesus? You know, my last book is Leaving and Finding Jesus. It's this discovery of a love that doesn't look away, and I'm so grateful for where you're where you're tracking and what you're sharing with us, brother. This is profoundly beautiful.
It's good to talk to you, Jason. Honestly, it is. Great to talk about these things because they matter more than anything. And they bring purpose as well, don't they?
100%. And when we, you know, just thanks to Mary Hooper.
Yeah, that's why I stay in touch with her. And as I said earlier, I said, I thank her all the time. I tell her I owe her everything.
Oh my goodness, man. We got to before I let you go, and by the way, the lost message of Paul continues this conversation in some really beautiful, practical ways. Love the way you write too, storyteller. We did talk about it in some roundabout ways, but I would recommend that as well. But we got to talk tacos. I only got you for a couple minutes. Rethinking God with tacos. The idea was, can we have a better thought about who he is together than the last best thought we had? And let's not take ourselves too seriously. Everything's done in community around a table. So tacos, it's an Americanized, it's actually not an American food, but we've become infatuated with it over here. And you got a taco story?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, taco, the meaning of the word taco is it means light meal. Because I live in central London, you have no idea how many restaurants there are outside this very door, street food of every sort you can imagine. So, yeah, we have tacos here. But, you know, because I'm Indian, a light meal, and the perfect taco to me would be curry filled. If I only had one meal left, it would be curry because I grew up on curry. Curry. My dad was a great cook. I love an Indian curry. A, a curried taco.
That's our first curry taco, and I'll take it. And when I was in London, we ate very well a couple of weeks ago, and I can attest you guys have got a lot of good food there. But I can put up where people will find you. But is there any last message or anywhere that you'd like to have people find you?
The reason I wrote The Lost Message of Paul, so only since you've talked about it, was this. A lot of people say, well, you know, Jesus was a nice guy. You know, I mean, in the end, Jesus said, "Love your enemy and do a lot of good stuff." You know, and it's all simple, and I go with that. Paul, on the other hand, is misogynistic, is judgmental, is against anybody and everything, and his writings are so dense, and he's always going on about circumcision and food laws and works of the flesh and all this kind of stuff. And you see, I was driven to write The Lost Message of Paul because going back to where we started, really, if I can't genuinely square, Paul wrote almost half of the entire New Testament, you know, like a whacking huge percentage of it. So if you can't square these teachings with these understandings we've talked about, it's not that you're trying to squeeze them into. Are there ways in which I can manipulate the text so it comes out saying what I want to say? You can't do that. Well, I suppose you can do it, but you can't live with yourself. You've got to genuinely look at these texts. And so I decided, in fact, I got a friend, her name's Danielle, and she did theology at Oxford at university. And she said to me one day, she's a real feminist, you know, and she said, Steve, whatever you say, I'm never going to change my mind about Paul. Like he hated women, and I hate him. and and that, I suppose, if anything, that's what triggered me because I thought, what did he? And so I wrote, it's the most theological book I think I've ever written. It's got 340 footnotes in it. So I wrote it at a popular level, so you can, you know, with the stories and all the rest, and you can read it without the footnotes. But in case people go, yeah, well, it's fine for Steve to say this, but how does he back that up? I've got more theological footnotes than you can, you know, ever want in your life. So, and because I came to the conclusion we've misunderstood Paul completely. We've totally misunderstood this wonderful man who, fiercely was against the first followers of Jesus and wanted to persecute them and wipe them out because of an understanding or misunderstanding he had about who they were and what it was all about. I explain it in my book. But then he has this incredible moment, this psychological moment on this road, the road to Damascus, and his whole world is broken down and he's on the floor and he has no idea what's going on. But he knows he's been wrong. And I won't spoil the book by telling you how we know that. He knows he's made a giant mistake. And he gives the rest of his life to his last breath with the same enthusiasm he had for exterminating these followers of Jesus, to proclaiming this great message about Jesus everywhere. He travels thousands of miles on the transport systems of the day, which is really boats that sink, donkeys and walking. He's thrown into prisons and jails. He's stoned. He's thrown out of cities and towns. He's misunderstood. He's abused. He goes without food. He struggles through everything because he desperately wants to bring this good news to people. And so the question that the lost message of Paul answers, does the good news of Paul fit with the good news of Jesus? My answer is it really does. But you've got to study it.
I can't recommend it enough, and I love that the catalyst was a feminist, because that's I've run up against that myself. I think that you're scratching a very real itch, and I'm glad that you just gave us a snippet of. I can't recommend the book enough. So this has been an incredible joy. Talking to you, Steve, getting to know you a little bit here, and truly honored that you could take the time and spend it with me a little bit and share with us your story and a little bit about how good God is and the ways in which he's moving in your life.
Thank you very much.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, myself, or our guests, you can go to afamilystory.org. You can also go to afamilystory.org if you'd like to give. This is a listener-supported podcast, and we are incredibly grateful for your generosity. Hey, we have a Facebook group, and it's pretty cool. Rethinking God with Tacos. You can join us over there. Lots of incredible conversation and community taking place on that page. And you can also follow us on all the socials, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and others. Hey, I'd love it also if you went on iTunes and left a review or shared or tweeted or liked the podcast. Let your friends know that this is a good place to hear about the love of God. I pray grace and wonder over your day.